Inside the hospital room, the billionaire sat motionless, staring at his son's covered body. The machines were silent now. The medical staff had finished their documentation. Someone had mentioned the morgue. Someone had asked about funeral arrangements. The words had washed over him without meaning, like a language he'd forgotten how to understand. His son was dead. Caleb was dead. The boy who'd been laughing just hours ago. The boy he'd argued with about something so trivial he couldn't even remember what it was. The boy he'd failed to know, failed to understand, failed to prioritize above board meetings and business deals and all the things that had seemed so important until they didn't matter at all. The nurse approached gently. "Sir, you don't have to stay. We can handle." "I'm staying." His voice was hollow but firm. He couldn't leave, couldn't walk out of this room and into a world where his son didn't exist. Not yet, maybe not ever. But something nagged at him. That boy in the hallway. The homeless kid who'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced that the doctors were wrong. The way he'd screamed through glass, the desperation in his voice, the refusal to accept what everyone else had accepted. "It's not too late." The words echoed. I saw him move. The billionaire's mind, foggy with grief, tried to make sense of it. The kid had been crazy, obviously. Probably mentally ill, probably traumatized, probably seeing things that weren't there. Street kids often had issues, their minds damaged by poverty and drugs and who knew what else. But there had been something in those eyes. Not madness. Certainty. The kind of certainty that came from knowledge, not delusion. And the timing. The kid had started screaming right after the pronouncement of death. Right when the billionaire's eyes snapped to the bed. Right when someone might have noticed something if they'd been paying attention instead of performing the ritual of death. His heart rate picked up. This was stupid. He was grasping at straws, letting desperation cloud his judgment, allowing false hope to creep in when he should be accepting reality. But what if? What if that kid, homeless, dismissed, ignored, had seen something that trained doctors had missed? What if they'd been too quick to pronounce death, too ready to give up? What if his son was still fighting and no one was listening? The thought was intolerable. If there was even a 1% chance, even a fraction of a possibility, and he did nothing, he couldn't live with that. The billionaire stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward. The doctor looked up from his paperwork. "Sir, check him again." The words came out steady despite the chaos in his mind. The doctor's expression shifted to irritation. "Sir, I understand this is difficult, but we've already. Check him again." Louder now, firmer, with all the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed, who had spent decades making people do what he wanted through sheer force of will and the power that money provided. The room stilled. Nurses exchanged glances. The doctor's jaw tightened. "Sir, there's no medical indication." "I don't care." The billionaire's voice cracked. "That boy said he saw movement. He was certain. And I'm telling you, I'm demanding that you check one more time." The doctor opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to reconsider. This was a billionaire. A man who could make life very difficult for everyone in this room if he chose to. A man whose lawyers could tie the hospital up in litigation for years. A man whose grief was turning into something that looked like it might become problematic if not handled carefully. "Very well," the doctor said, his tone making clear this was a waste of time but he'd humor the grieving father. "But I want you to understand that this is highly unusual. The patient has been flatlined for several minutes. Even if we detected any activity now, the likelihood of meaningful recovery. Just check." The doctor approached the bed with exaggerated reluctance. He placed his fingers on Caleb's neck with the kind of theatrical precision meant to prove he was doing everything properly so that later, when this inevitably led nowhere, he could document that he'd complied with the father's unreasonable request. His fingers found the carotid artery, pressed in, waited for the beat that wouldn't come. Nothing. Of course nothing. He started to pull his hand back, started to shake his head, started to form the words that would tell the billionaire what he already knew. Then he felt it. Not a pulse exactly. Not the strong, rhythmic throb that indicated normal cardiac function. But something. A tremor. A vibration. So faint he almost dismissed it as his own pulse, but no, wrong frequency. Wrong location. The doctor's expression changed. His eyes narrowed. His hand repositioned, pressing in a different spot. Checking again. There. Stronger this time. Unmistakable. Not a pulse yet, but movement. Electrical activity. The heart attempting to restart itself, trying to remember its rhythm, fighting to come back online despite having been flatlined. Did you see that? The billionaire whispered, afraid to hope, terrified to believe. The doctor didn't answer. He kept his fingers pressed to Caleb's neck, counting silently, trying to determine if what he was feeling was real or artifact, significant or meaningless. But that moment of hesitation, that crack in his certainty, was everything. "We have activity," the doctor said quietly, and then louder with sudden urgency. "Get the crash cart. Now!" The room exploded into motion. A nurse ran for equipment. Another started checking Caleb's airway, his foreline, his monitor connections. Someone paged additional staff. Someone started preparing medications. The billionaire collapsed back into his chair, hands covering his face, shoulders shaking. Relief and terror and disbelief all crashed over him at once. And outside, in the rain-soaked darkness, Eli stopped pacing. Something had changed. He couldn't explain how he knew, couldn't quantify what felt different. But something in the air had shifted. Possibility had opened. A door that had seemed sealed had cracked open just slightly. He turned back toward the hospital, bare feet moving across cold concrete. Something drawing him back even though he'd been thrown out, even though returning meant risking arrest. He had to know. Inside the room, the medical team worked with renewed purpose. The heart monitor, which had been flat and silent, now showed occasional small blips, irregular, unorganized, but present. Evidence that the body was trying, that death hadn't yet won. "Epinephrine 0.5 milligrams, the doctor ordered. "Starting chest compressions," a nurse announced, positioning her hands over Caleb's sternum. The rhythmic pressing began again, but now with the support of medications, of electrical monitoring, of a team that had shifted from managing death to fighting for life. "Come on," the doctor muttered, watching the monitor. "Come on, kid. You can do this." Minutes passed. The compressions continued. More medications were administered. The monitor showed increasingly organized activity, not quite normal but trending toward it like an engine trying to start, catching and dying until finally, a beep, strong, clear, unmistakable. Then another. "We have sinus rhythm," someone called out. The monitor showed a heartbeat, irregular but present. Caleb's chest began to rise and fall more naturally under the ventilator's assistance. Color started to return to his lips, just slightly, just enough to notice. The doctor stepped back, breathing hard, staring at Caleb as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "That's not," he shook his head. "That shouldn't be possible." He was flatlined for at least 6 minutes. The brain damage alone. But Caleb's heart kept beating. His body kept fighting. Against all odds, against medical expectation, against the pronouncement that had been made and documented. Life was reasserting itself. The billionaire stood on shaking legs and approached the bed. His hand reached out, hovering over Caleb's, afraid to touch, afraid this might be a dream or a hallucination born of desperate hope. Then he touched his son's hand. It was warm, not cold like it had been, not the temperature of a dead body. Warm with circulating blood, with a heart that was beating, with life that had come back from wherever it had gone. He broke down completely then, sobbing openly, not caring who saw, not caring about dignity or image or any of the things he'd spent his life obsessing over. His son was alive. That was the only thing that mattered. The only thing that had ever mattered. A nurse came to his side, her own eyes wet. "Sir, he's not out of danger yet. We need to get him stabilized, run tests, determine if there's brain function. But he's alive. Yes, he's alive." The next hours were a blur. Caleb was moved to intensive care. Tests were run. Scans were performed. The medical team worked with a mixture of professional focus and genuine amazement. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Patients who'd been flatlined for that long didn't just restart. And when they did, they came back with massive brain damage, with organs that had been starved of oxygen, with quality of life so compromised that saving them felt questionable. But Caleb's scans showed minimal damage. His brain function was remarkably intact. His organs were beginning to work properly. It was as if the drowning and the cardiac arrest had put him in some kind of protective state, preserving function that should have been lost. The doctors called it a miracle, but the billionaire knew better. As dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital windows with pink and gold light, he stepped out into the hallway. He needed air, needed space, needed a moment to process what had just happened. And there, at the end of the corridor, trying to stay out of sight but unable to leave, was the boy, Eli. He looked like he'd aged years in the past few hours. Soaked, shaking, exhausted. But his eyes were alert, focused on the ICU doors, watching, waiting, needing to know. Their eyes met, and the billionaire understood in that moment the magnitude of what this homeless child had done. He walked toward Eli slowly, each step feeling significant, weighted with meaning. When he reached the boy, he didn't speak immediately, just looked at him. Really looked at him, seeing past the dirty clothes and bare feet and unwashed skin, seeing the person underneath, the soul that had fought for a stranger when everyone else had given up. "He's alive," the billionaire said finally, his voice hoarse from crying. "My son is alive." Eli's knees nearly buckled with relief. He'd been holding himself together through sheer force of will, and now that will cracked, letting in the exhaustion and emotion he'd been suppressing. "They checked again," he whispered. "Because of you. Because you wouldn't be quiet. Because you saw what they didn't." The billionaire's voice broke. "You saved his life. A child I didn't know I'd failed until I almost lost him. And you had no reason to care, no connection to us, nothing to gain. But you fought for him anyway." He knelt, bringing himself to Eli's eye level despite his expensive suit and the dirty hospital floor. "What's your name?" "Eli." "Elijah. Elijah." The billionaire repeated it with something like reverence. "Like the prophet. That fits." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know where you'll go from here. I don't know your story or how you came to be watching through that window. But I need you to know something." Eli waited, unsure what to expect. "You matter. Your voice matters. What you saw and what you did. It mattered more than anything I've ever accomplished with all my money and power. And I won't forget that. Ever." Eli felt tears coming, fought them back, nodded silently. "Can I help you?" the billionaire asked. "Food? Shelter? Medical care? Whatever you need, please. Let me do something." Eli shook his head instinctively, the automatic response of someone who'd learned not to depend on anyone, not to accept help that might come with strings. But the billionaire wasn't done. "At least take my card," he said, pulling out a business card and pressing it into Eli's hand. "Call me. Anytime. For anything. You gave me back my son. That's a debt I can never repay, but I'd like to try." Eli took the card, looked at it, expensive paper, embossed lettering. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Elijah." As Eli walked out of the hospital and into the morning light, he felt different. Lighter somehow. Not because his circumstances had changed. He was still homeless, still hungry, still facing a day of surviving on the streets. But because something fundamental had shifted. His voice had mattered. Someone had listened, and a life had been saved because of it. In the days and weeks that followed, the story could have ended there. Eli could have disappeared back into the city's invisible population, and the billionaire could have returned to his life, grateful but unchanged. But that's not what happened. The billionaire couldn't shake what had occurred. Couldn't forget the homeless boy who'd seen death more clearly than trained doctors. Couldn't stop thinking about how close he'd come to losing Caleb, and how it was the voice everyone dismissed that had made the difference. He hired private investigators to find Eli. Not to force anything, but to understand. To learn his story. To see if there was a way to help that Eli might actually accept. When they finally reconnected 3 weeks after that night, it was tentative. Careful. The billionaire brought food, offered it without pressure. They talked. Or rather, Eli talked, haltingly at first, then more freely, about Noah, about the river, about Jonah, about losing everything and learning to survive on streets that didn't want him. And the billionaire listened. Really listened. In a way he'd never listened to anyone, including his own son. Caleb was recovering well, better than anyone had expected. The doctors were amazed by how little damage there was, how quickly he was regaining function. He remembered the party, remembered the lake, didn't remember drowning or dying or being brought back. For him, it was like waking from a very long, very strange sleep. When the billionaire told him about Eli, about the homeless boy who'd fought for him when everyone else had given up, Caleb insisted on meeting him. Their first meeting was awkward. Caleb in a wheelchair, still weak. Eli standing near the door, ready to run. Both uncertain what to say. "You saved my life," Caleb said finally. "I don't know how to thank you for that."
Eli shrugged, uncomfortable.
"You would have done the same." "I don't know if I would have," Caleb admitted honestly. "I don't know if I would have fought that hard for a stranger." Over time, something unexpected happened. They became friends. Different as they were, one rich, one homeless. One educated, one self-taught. One with every advantage, one with none. They found common ground in their shared understanding of what it meant to be unseen. Caleb, despite his wealth, had been invisible to his father in the ways that mattered. Eli, despite being present, had been invisible to society in every way. They bonded over that invisibility. And slowly, carefully, the billionaire proposed something that seemed impossible. Adoption. "I can't replace what you've lost," he told Eli. "Can't undo the years on the street. Can't give you back your brother or your mother or your childhood. But I can offer you a home, family, opportunities, safety." The process took months. Background checks, court hearings, social workers, psychologists. The system that had failed to protect Eli now worked slowly to ensure this arrangement wouldn't harm him. During those months, Eli stayed in a guest house on the property, enrolled in tutoring, saw doctors and dentists, learned to eat regular meals, to sleep without vigilance, to exist without constant fear. And slowly he healed. Not completely. Trauma doesn't work that way, but enough to begin building a new life. The billionaire changed too. He cut back on work, spent more time with both boys, learned to be present in ways he'd never been before. Caleb's near death had shattered his priorities. Eli's presence reminded him daily what mattered. Meanwhile, the hospital faced scrutiny, not just from the billionaire's lawyers, but from public outcry, from medical boards reviewing procedures, from the attention that comes when a major mistake nearly becomes fatal. Protocols changed. Staff retrained. New guidelines emphasized multiple confirmations before pronouncing death. Eli's story sparked broader conversations about homelessness, about whose voices get heard, about the knowledge that exists in unexpected places. Years passed. Eli became Dr. Elijah Moore. A long, difficult path that required overcoming trauma, academic gaps, and the psychological weight of being saved when so many others weren't. But he had motivation. Every time the work seemed too hard, he remembered that night. Remembered refusing to be silent. Remembered Noah. Remembered Jonah. He specialized in emergency medicine naturally. Worked in trauma centers where split-second decisions mattered, where his street-honed instincts became his greatest asset. And one night, years later, when he was attending physician in his own ER, a nurse came running. "Dr. Moore, we have a patient. Homeless. Brought in by police. Declared dead at the scene, but someone thought they saw movement."
Eli listened.
He listened when other doctors might have dismissed it, when paperwork said it was over, when every incentive suggested accepting the initial assessment. He went to check. And there, standing in the hallway near the room, watching through the window with desperate eyes, was a child. Maybe 11 years old. Street clothes. Dirty. Scared. Looking exactly like Eli had looked all those years ago. Their eyes met, and Eli understood. He checked the patient despite every indication it was pointless. Pressed his fingers to a neck that should have shown nothing. Waited. Listened. Felt for what everyone else had missed. And there, so faint as to be almost nothing but not quite nothing, he felt it. The flutter. The tremor. The fight. Get the crash cart, Eli said calmly. As his team worked, as they brought someone back who'd been pronounced gone, Eli looked at the child in the hallway, caught the kid's eye, nodded. I see you. I heard you. Your voice matters. And the child understood that someone had listened, that their observations had value, that they hadn't been dismissed. The cycle continued. Knowledge passing from Jonah to Eli to this new invisible witness who might grow up remembering that their voice made a difference, who might carry forward the lesson that the world's discarded sometimes see truths everyone else misses. Because once upon a time, an old drunk fisherman refused to give up on a drowning boy, and a homeless teenager learned to never be silent when life was still fighting. And a billionaire's son learned that wealth meant nothing compared to human connection and listening to voices you might otherwise ignore. And a doctor remembered, every single day, that his patients deserved the same stubborn refusal to quit that Jonah had shown, that Eli had insisted upon, that had made the difference between tragedy and miracle. The hospital lights hummed their endless tune. Rain fell somewhere outside, as it had that night years ago. And in room after room, in crisis after crisis, in the space between breathing and not breathing, Dr. Elijah Moore listened for the fight. Because the body gives up before the heart does. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, refusing to accept the obvious truth is the bravest, smartest, most important thing you can do.